Mac Power Users, episode 551, Writing Music for the Picture Business with David Metzger. Hello, everyone. This is David Sparks, joined by my pal, Mr. Stephen Hackett. How are you, Stephen?
I am good. It's another week and another MPU.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. We have a special guest. I can't wait to introduce him in just a minute. But before we do, how are things going with the St. Jude fundraiser?
Yeah, it's going well. So we are now a couple weeks into it, right on the verge of September, which I think is when we'll really kick it into overdrive. If you haven't heard about this, if you're not familiar with St. Jude, it's a children's research hospital actually in my hometown of Memphis. It's like 20 minutes from my house. And in September, Relay honors Childhood Cancer Awareness Month by raising money for St. Jude. And you may think, well, it's like a random charity in Memphis. Well, it's not. It's a hospital that treats children and really takes care of their whole family without regard to their ability to pay, where they're from, what they believe, anything like that. And they saved the life of my oldest son, who had a brain tumor when he was a baby, and now he is in 5th grade, and that's because of the work at St. Jude. So we would love your support. You can go to stjude.org/relay, and you can follow the network on Twitter. We're going to be announcing live streams and different events throughout the month of September.
Yeah, lots of events going on. We are so proud to be a part of it. I feel honored that Mac Power Users could play a small role in this. And MPU audience, this is our ask. Help us out. Yep. Go to stjude.org/relay. Donate some money. We want to beat last year. We don't care that there's a pandemic going on. We still want to do better than last year. So just put some money in there. I'll be making my contribution here shortly, and I can't wait to see how well we can do this month. All right. So this guest, my wife and I are fans of Disney, as you may know. And of course, we have the Disney Plus channel. And so we were watching the making of the Frozen 2 movie, which, sounds boring, but it was fascinating to see these people with these extraordinary expectations against them. That first movie just kind of blew the roof off. So they wanted to make a sequel.
Dude, I watched it 137 times with my kids.
Yeah, exactly. But as a parent, I'll tell you, watching the making of it's fascinating because, it's a study in pressure. These people are trying to live up to the first one. And how do you do that? How do you not make the second one a complete failure? But as part of the process, at one point, they get into the music. And there's this guy in his studio up in Oregon, and he's got all this gear, and he's the guy who scores the whole film. He takes all the music, he puts it together. They eventually end up in the recording studio with the orchestra. And he had a Apple keyboard right under his piano keyboard. And all of a sudden I start seeing like little pieces of Apple gear all over the place. And I can tell this guy's a nerd. And I'm like, I want to talk to this guy. And it turns out he's one of us, and he agreed to come on the show. So welcome to the show, David Metzger.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for inviting me and having me on the show.
Yeah. So David has a rich history of composing and arranging. Movies he's done this work on include Frozen, Moana, The Simpsons, August Rush, Night at the Museum, Captain America, Lion King, Wreck-It Ralph. He's also done stuff for Broadway. He's a Tony nominated for scoring the Lion King on Broadway. He's done Frozen. He's currently working on a version of August Rush for Broadway. First, David, I can't believe that you made time for us because I know how busy you are.
Well, when I'm not really invited to do things like this very often, and so when I am, it's actually a huge honor to me because I usually am kind of the hidden guy in the whole process, and so it when you first reach out to me, it was like, oh my gosh, somebody actually is interested in what I do.
I mean, that is an interesting point. David, I agree with you. I love making ofs. Like, I will always watch those. And I mean, it's amazing how many people with amazing talent and specific knowledge go into making these massive projects, right? We just think about the people we see on the screen, but there's an army of amazing people making it all possible. It's really cool to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, and the music part of it, and we're going to go deep into David's workflow, but it's all on Apple technology. But, you take a little ditty, a little melody, but then you got to turn that into a piece for, a big multi-piece orchestra and horn section. And you've got to arrange it and score it. And this is all Apple stuff behind the scenes doing this. And it's just great.
Yeah, it's Apple's made my life massively easier and better and more creative. And so I'm a huge fan.
And we're going to get into it during the episode, but one of the things about this is people that do the work David do are some of the biggest power users of Apple hardware, because to score this, they have all these files with all these individual wave files for each note on each instrument. And the compute power for what he's doing is quite extraordinary. So we're going to be talking about that too. But before we move on, the one more thing about your background, this is the part where Steven he's standing off stage with that, that hook, getting ready to pull me out. But the one thing because I was looking at your Wikipedia, and this turned into a whole thread of emails between us and phone conversations. But when I was in high school, I was a big into jazz, as listeners know, and I did with the state jazz band. I did all this stuff, but there was this guy, this trumpet player named Maynard Ferguson, which if you've never heard of him, he means nothing to you, but he was this jazz player who was famous for hitting remarkably high notes on the trumpet. He started with Stan Kenton, and he had his own band. And when I was in high school, we all worshiped Maynard. I mean, Maynard had a gap between his teeth. And I remember trumpet players saying, that's why he can hit those high notes. And people thinking about like putting a gap in their teeth just to hit the notes. And then, of course, right. Maynard got some money and he got his teeth fixed. And everybody's like, well, that wasn't it, But but anyway, David was his arranger. So on top of, these, Oscar movies that he's worked on, he also worked with Maynard Ferguson. And I just have to acknowledge that.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was actually, as we went back and forth on our emails, it was one of the kind of cool things of my earlier career, because Maynard had been a huge idol of mine as well, and when I was in high school. And so having the opportunity to actually work with him and write some charts for him was one of the cool things of my 20s.
All right, we got to put one Maynard song in the show notes for the listeners. What's the one? Or actually, is there one recorded that you arranged that you particularly like?
Yeah, actually, I think the one that probably was the longest running that he played all the way up until he passed away was my arrangement of "But Beautiful," which is a classic jazz chart, and so that one is actually the one that I'm probably the most proud of in my work with Maynard.
All right, we'll put that in, but we're also going to put La Fiesta in, because you got to have one.
There you go,
Maynard blowing it up. All right, so I'll put those in the show notes. If you guys have any interest in Maynard Ferguson, I have now got out my system. I think we're safe now, Steven.
That's cool. Let's talk about computers.
So computers. David, you are an Apple guy, and it goes back a while. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your history with Apple computers?
Yeah. Well, I think my first exposure that I really remember was to an Apple II, and that probably would have been around 1980 or 81. And I didn't own it, but I remember I had a friend who had one, and it just seemed like kind of the future. And I am old enough to where I kind of learned the first parts of music, or my first exposure to music was before computers, at least before they were common. And so I did everything by hand up to a certain point. But then when I saw computers kind of come around, personal computers, I realized, well, this is kind of the future, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of learn how they work and see, because even though at that point they really couldn't do a whole lot in as far as music goes, I could see that there was a potential there to, to really, be fascinating. And to be honest, the first computer I owned was not an Apple. And I hope that's okay. I hope I'm not going to be banished. But
Wait, let me guess. Was it an Atari ST?
How did you know?
Because that was the one with the built-in MIDI ports. All the musicians
exactly
started
right.
with that. Yeah,
that's exactly right. I had a 1040 ST, and I think I was like the first week that they were out, I got one, because it just seemed like because it had the built-in MIDI, and it had as I recall, I had a whole megabyte of RAM in the machine, and just all those kind of great specs back in the day, and it had the built-in floppy drive. That was the other thing that was kind of cool. But and I want to say, was that like 85 or 86 maybe? It
Yeah,
seems
that's
like it was
about
kind
that
of the
time.
mid
Yeah.
80s. Yeah, yeah. So I had the other thing about the Atari is that it had a program, and I think it was called SMPTE Track. And so they also then, I believe Steinberg made that program. I might be wrong, but it came with a SMPTE box, and so SMPTE was what allowed back in those days to be able to synchronize the computer with tape, like 2-inch recording tape. It was before really hard disk recording was really viable. And so that was another cool thing about the Atari is it had a great way to sync up to computer. But so I used that for a couple of years, and then I kind of realized I think the main instigator for me to really buy my first Mac was a program called Finale, and that's a notation software. So it's putting notes on the page. And when I first saw the first version of that, I realized again that was like the future, and it was something I really needed to do. And so I bought my first Mac was an SE, and I don't really remember the specs on it, but that would have probably been kind of like 98 or 88, 1988, I think it would have been. And it was so frustrating at times because it was so slow to process anything, but I realized again that was my inroad to Finale. So I was able to start with Finale fairly quickly after it had been released. And start working on notation stuff. So in that SE, then I remember I hot rodded it at one point where I got a processor upgrade that you had to kind of like really crack open the machine, and you were kind of like taking your life in your hands, sort of, as far as shorting everything out, and all of a sudden the computer's dead.
Yeah. I mean, people today don't realize, like back then, when we upgraded our computer, it often involved a soldering iron. I mean, and I'm not like exaggerating.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So Finale is actually still around. They're on version 26. Is that still in your life today? Is it held on through the years?
Well, it is still around. It's on my computer. I actually migrated away about maybe 12 years ago. I went over to the competing program called Sibelius. But though I still have to use Finale once in a while, a lot of Broadway work is still actually in Finale. And it's kind of amazing to me that program is still around and it's still viable, because the code, a lot of the base code is still like that original stuff from back in the 80s. And it's kind of stunning that they've been able to keep it as a viable and vibrant program. But so I kind of moved away to Sibelius, and I don't know what kind of order you want to do this in, but I moved away just because it seemed like it had a better workflow for me at one point, and I had a colleague recommend it. But I was kind of a Finale nerd, actually. In throughout the 90s, I wrote a book on how to arrange jazz band charts in Finale. So I really was a deep diver in the kind of earlier stages of the program. And it was the kind of deal where I would just read the manual. The manual is like 1,000 pages long or something, and it was that deal where every night, that was my reading material in bed. I'd read I'd read another chapter of, and always be looking for ways to improve my workflow and learn the little hidden things. And Finale was notorious for everything was deep dive menu driven, so you'd have to drill down through like 10 dialogue boxes to get to where you really wanted to back in the early days. And so you had to learn what you had to do to get to those. But anyway, so I used that SE and hot rodded it and got as much life out of it as I could, and eventually started moving through the other Macs of the 90s. And I kind of remember, I think I had a Centrus. Do you guys remember that? Like Centrus computers, the Mac Centrus models?
Yeah, it was very short lived. They did not stick around very long.
That's right. For a good reason, yeah. But I just because I remember it was pretty awkward to use. But I also remember at the end of the 80s, I had a colleague that I was working with that actually bought, was it the golly, XV or something, or it was like, oh golly, now I've blanked on the model number, but I just remember he paid like $12,000 for this computer, and I was going, holy cow, because I was young guy at that point. I couldn't even dream of paying that much, but again, I realized how much his workflow was improved by having a way more powerful computer than what I had.
Mm-hmm.
And so it again set in my mind that, trying to be on, if not the cutting edge, at least on the very close to the cutting edge of computers would do me well. So I went through the 90s, and I got I had like a Power Mac in the late 90s too, and then got into the 2000s and went through a couple of G4s, and then later on had a couple of G5s, and then ended up having one of those Mac Pros that were the cheese graters. You guys remember those, I'm sure.
They're still around for some folks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do have a friend that still uses one, indeed, and they were great machines. But I would always kind of be on the front edge. I would always buy the most expensive processor and jam as much RAM as I could, and get the biggest hard drives and all that stuff, and then I finally kind of hit. And I went through a phase of a whole bunch of Mac Minis. So there was one point where I had 6 Mac Minis. And because I wanted to be kind of more portable, so I had like this contraption I'd rigged up to where I racked up 6 Mac Minis in like this plastic plexiglass kind of container that I could cart around with me, and so I had that kind of rigged for about.
That's kind of interesting because for what you do, so those were kind of networked computers then.
Correct. Yeah, and a part of that then is kind of getting into the gear and the way that I've set up. And just to finish off kind of my Mac history, if you don't mind,
Sure.
I just ended up, or then at about, I think it was about 2015, I bought my first Mac Pro, that was the, for lack of a better word, the trash can, or the cylindrical guy. And I say that in all love, because I love that machine. So I bought my first one in about 2015, and about a year later, I bought another one, and I've maxed them out to 128 gigs of RAM, and got the 12 core processors and all of that. And then I've had a succession of MacBook Pros, and back to, I think, 1996 was my first Apple laptop that I bought, or Mac laptop. And I've probably had about 15 laptops over, in that intervening 22 years or so. But so the way that my rig currently is I have a MacBook Pro. It's a 2018 i9 is my kind of main computer. And then I use those 2013 Mac Pros as my, that's where I have all my sounds, essentially.
Yeah.
And so I run Cubase and Sibelius on my on the MacBook Pro, and then all of my sounds are loaded up in those trash cans.
You said something that stood out to me. You said that you were always trying to be on the cutting edge, yet you stayed with the Mac through the 90s. Was there ever a moment in those dark years that you really thought, I gotta go?
Yeah, to be honest, there was in the mid 90s. It was kind of like, I wasn't sure about the viability of the future of Apple and Macs, and so I dabbled a little bit in the dark side, and had actually I even had like a clone for a while.
Nice,
because I didn't want to leave Macs, and so I got a clone, and I can't remember which maker it was now, because I know there were a couple of companies that were making them, and that kept me in the in the family. It kind of bridged the gap, frankly. And I have owned, I might be banned, but I have owned probably 8 or 9 PCs, over the years. To the last time I turned one on would have been probably about 2008. But there was a period of time there where there was a program called Giga Studio. Don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but it was a sample player, and it only was on the PC platform. But before that, I had like 24 Roland samplers, and so I had these huge rack bays of just these one space samplers that played back. It was before computers could actually again stream the samples audio wise. So I had this whole huge rack and network of these hardware samplers. And that maxed out, I think, at 64 megabytes or something of sound. So that's why I had to have so many. But once those, became so hard to manage, then this PC program called Giga Studio came out, and everybody switched over to that in the early 2000s. But then finally, a company came up with a a version that kind of was similar on Apple on Macs. So that's when I went back to Macs and all my Mac Minis. That's when that kind of happened. So I've been loyal all the way through. I've never not had Macs, but I have. I was tempted at one point to move on.
You realize talking Mac history is Steven's equivalent of Maynard Ferguson, right?
That's right. Yeah. Playing jazz now, baby.
That's right. I'm glad I can converse with both you guys on some level. So.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by TextExpander. Go to textexpander.com/podcast to learn more and get 20% off your first year. Now, if you've got a team, you need TextExpander. Your team can do more with the same resources using TextExpander. There's less repetition, fewer errors, and greater consistency, and they'll feel like they're hopping off a bicycle and onto a Ferrari. Keep your team consistent and accurate and current with TextExpander for Teams, where you can share snippets, share your text and images with the whole staff to keep them on track. Everyone will share the same message and give the same answers to all customer questions. They can work faster and smarter. And you can use TextExpander's powerful shortcuts and abbreviations to streamline and speed up everything. I've got a TextExpander for Teams account. I've been paying for it for a few years now, and I've got my virtual assistant on it with me. This is really useful to us because we use TextExpander for customer support and some of the other back-end stuff we do with the field guides. A few of these bits require a changing URL that changes every month. Well, my virtual assistant goes in and changes that for me at the beginning of each month. So when I go in and start using that snippet, it just automatically has the right URL in it. It doesn't take any of my time. I don't have to think about it. It just works. And that's all because we have the TextExpander for Teams set up. So keep your whole team commuting efficiently with the consistent language. Share your snippets of messaging, signatures, and descriptions with everyone who works on projects with you. TextExpander is available for Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad, so no matter what platform your team works on, you're covered. And best of all, show listeners get 20% off their first year. I've heard from some of our listeners that are using TextExpander at their work with their team, and they love it. Show listeners get 20% off their first year. Visit textexpander.com/podcast to learn more about TextExpander. Thanks, TextExpander, for all of your support of the Mac Power Users. I think something kind of critical for the audience to understand about David's workflow, though, is that he is orchestrating. So, when you have a movie and you go in the theater and you hear all the strings and the horns and the guitars and all that going, David's job is to construct that music, to take whatever, the film composer has written, or if David writes it himself, and then build that out for all those musicians that day they record. And the way people do that is they use computers to simulate all those voices. So as you're writing it, you can hear what it sounds like. And that's what kind of gets back to some of the points you were making before. Why do you need to stack 6 Mac Minis together? Why do you need a room full of those roll-ins? Was it the sound canvas that you were using? I think that was the one I had back.
They were actually S760s. They were, yeah.
But there were devices. And when the technology first started back in the day, because the computers could not have the processing power, the input-output speed, and all the things you need to run those voicings off your computer, you had to send a MIDI signal to something else that could actually make the sound. So David's been kind of down the road. And now we've reached a point where you can put that stuff on the computer. But as we move forward with time, those samples get better and bigger, and as a result, it takes a massive amount of compute power, which is why someone would need a laptop with 2 Mac Pros slaved to it to do his job.
Correct. Yeah, well said. Actually, that was a perfect description of the need for the computers, and why it took so long to get to the point of where doing it kind of at the level that I do it. Was even able to be done on computers.
So you talk, and I've heard people in your line of work talk about this, but I honestly don't understand how it works. So you've got a laptop, and then you've got 2 Mac Pros feeding into that laptop, and you said that's where you hold your sounds,
right?
How does that work?
So it's a lot of networking, and so there's, as you alluded to earlier, there's really 2 parts of the process. There's MIDI information, which is getting the note on, like when you, so like I have a MIDI keyboard that's hooked up to that laptop, and so when I play notes on the keyboard, it then sends MIDI information through to those remote Mac Pros, and where the sounds are stored, and it triggers those sounds over there. So that's route one, or path one on the route, and then the return path is then getting the audio from those computers back to my laptop. And that's done through, I use a program called Vienna Ensemble Pro. It's essentially an audio streaming app, I guess you would call it. But there's an interface that is on on the remote computers and the laptop. And it sends the audio then through Ethernet cables, to the laptop. And so then I mix the sounds in the laptop, and I have it's a Yamaha Dante card in a Sonnet chassis, a Sonnet Thunderbolt chassis, and that's what connects out to my audio interfaces and speakers and such.
Well, it's just a lot of computing. I remember last year Apple invited Stephen and I to the Mac Pro premiere, the new Mac Pro. What, is there a slang for the new Mac Pro, Steve? I mean, we got the cheese grater, we got the trash can.
I just keep calling it my precious. Don't know.
Yeah, Stephen has one.
Okay. I'm so jealous.
Yeah. But there was a guy there who worked on the most recent How to Train Your Dragon. I know you did the first two. This is the guy who worked on the third one, and he was talking to me. I wish I got his name, and of course I may have, but I can't find it now. But but he was talking about how he used to have like 4 computers, like one for strings, one for horns, and he did it all on the single new Mac Pro because it's kind of built more for expandability.
Exactly. Yeah.
Have you been tempted to like upgrade to the new system?
Yeah, honestly, I really have been. I mean, I've come real close to pulling the trigger a couple times, but I think part of it is, for me, things are working the way that I have my setup right now is working. And when you're in the middle of projects, the last thing you want to be doing is changing things out. And so a lot of the reason that I haven't done it is because of that. Just that I haven't had really the opportunity had a slowdown in my schedule to be able to go through that, because it's a couple of week process. Every time you swap out a computer or you bring new stuff in to get all the plugins activated and all the routing redone, and you need new templates and all that stuff. So it's a big commitment of time. And the other problem I have is I'm very fortunate, but I actually have 2 studios. I have 2 houses that are about 2.5 hours apart, and so I need to have I have a duplicate setup of everything in each house, so that I don't have to cart. The only thing I cart around is my laptop back and forth. So I have 2 other trash cans. I've got 4 trash cans total. I have 2 at each house. So if I was going to buy a new one of the new Mac Pros, I'd actually have to buy 2 new Mac Pros. Yeah. If that makes sense.
I get it. And honestly, you have too many gigs is what I'm getting from you. You don't have, you need to have downtime.
Yeah. I guess that's a horrible to actually say that, but I've been very, very fortunate without question, and I'm not complaining at all, but it is hard when, it's hard to make changes. And most people kind of who do what I do, they have technical assistants. They have like an employee that will do all the updates and all the wiring and all that stuff, but I've always done it all by myself. And so that just sort of makes it a little bit harder to find the time and the energy too, frankly. But I've always done it all myself because I've always been afraid of not understanding something. If I had a computer problem, I wanted to be, and it was like 3 a.m. I wanted to be able to figure it out myself or know at least where to start. And so that's one reason I've always just done it all myself too. And I kind of enjoy it too, I suppose.
And you can get wheels on that Mac Pro, so you could just roll it up, get like a ramp, roll it up into the back seat of the car, buckle it in, and take it with you. Be fine.
Yeah. Actually, when I first bought this other house, I did that I had like this crazy milk carton kind of way. I had my my trash cans in this milk crate, and I was sort of doing that. And then I realized I just can't do this, forever. So that's when I bought the other machines. But you're right, Stephen, that would kind of work. It would get the wheels and figure out some kind of lift system or something.
Yeah, this is the only way in which the wheels look affordable. It's like, well, I can get $700 wheels, or I can get a whole second Mac Pro. I'm here to help. I'm here to help.
I feel like, though, if you're going to move that Mac Pro at that cost, it needs like its own baby seat. Like somebody needs to make a Mac Pro baby seat.
Mac Pro car seat. That's a great idea.
And it comes with a sticker that says Mac Pro on board that you stick in your window.
Right.
Yeah. But I do think, though, I bet you could get it all in a Mac Pro whenever you get around to it. You'll have to let me know when you do that. One thing about the trash cans that, the knock against them is they made a great machine for people that want to like do audio, that want to do animation and like graphics work. But for the other kind of pro uses of a Mac, it really didn't satisfy them. And like, I'm thinking those trash cans you have, they have great video cards in them, but I'm guessing that is almost useless to you.
That's right. I just use screen sharing, so I don't have any monitor hooked up at all. Yeah, that's true. But I will say, so many people have the need for expansion, for cards or whatever. But I don't have any cards on those things at all. I just have, because it's all Ethernet. I just have an Ethernet cable jammed in there. I've got an external SSD drive that I do have connected to them, but they're these sleds. They're actually about 16 terabytes. I have two OWC Thunder Bay Mini, sleds with four drives, four terabyte SSD drives attached to each of them. That's where those sounds are stored. But that's it. I just I take the sleds back and forth along with the laptop actually. But that's all the expansion I need. I don't need other cards or anything like that. So for me, those trash cans are really pretty ideal. They're small too. I kind of like the footprint of them. It's pretty easy. I've got them racked up on their sides and stuff, but they actually they take up, for how much power they have, they take up very little space.
Well, David, you've got OWC accessories. You read 1,000-page manuals in your bed. You are at home on the Mac Power Users.
Oh, I was so worried. I thought, oh gosh, I'm not worthy to be on your show. But
you
that's
are.
so nice of you to say.
Another thing you told me on the phone you do that I think is kind of interesting, I want to hear more about, is you are also an iPad user, but iPads are actually part of your workflow. Could you explain that? Correct.
So the way my theory of, or my approach to technology is to make it a tool that works for you instead of like you have to struggle with, And so it's all about, for me, making it ergonomic and keeping that creative flow, keeping me having to think about technology out of the picture, if that makes sense, so I can concentrate on the music.
Yes.
But then because of that, I use a lot of control surfaces and little things. If we were doing a video, you could kind of see I have a little cockpit kind of set up, and at the center of that is, that keyboard that you talked about, my Apple keyboard. But then right above that is a Mac iPad Pro, and on that I'm running an app called Metagrid. I don't know if you guys have heard of that at all.
I think I've heard of that category. I haven't heard of that specific app, though. Explain it, what it does.
Yes. Yeah. So what it is it's essentially a keyboard shortcut machine, I guess. So you can program in any kind of a key command or anything you want to any program. I just happen to use it for Cubase and Sibelius. But so I have buttons. It's like a grid of, golly, I've forgotten. I'm just counting, like probably about 12 by maybe 20. So you have what is that? My mind's not working now, but you have a lot of buttons that you can program, and you can colorize them. And what I kind of like about it is it's not just a kind of a basic kind of button machine, but it actually will hook into Cubase. And so you can send direct commands instead of having to program inside of Cubase your shortcuts and stuff. So it's quite simple. I use Keyboard Maestro quite a bit. I was a Quick Keys user for a I mean, for a decade, probably until they kind of weren't around anymore, and switched over to
Yeah.
Keyboard Maestro. Yeah, and so I use that program as well, or that I guess it's a program. But the great thing about Metagrid is that it's the most visual thing that I can do, because you can colorize the buttons into different categories. And so I have buttons there that I can just touch that will then change the articulation on my sample libraries. So, and by that I mean you can have long strings, and then you can have different articulations that are recorded. They're all recorded by real musicians, but then you can have like staccatos, and you can have trills, and you can have pizzicato. But those things, if you can get really bogged down in switching between those articulations, if you aren't really thinking about it. So what Metagrid allows me to do is program buttons that make all those switches for me. Of course, I had to do the background work of programming the buttons, but it allows me to switch without even thinking about it between different sounds. And so it's much easier. It's the easiest way I've ever found. And in fact, Cubase has a section it's called a logical editor, and what it allows you to do is essentially write mini scripts to do whatever you want to within Cubase. And so I've written some scripts that just extremely speed up my workflow compared to, I think, people who don't take the time to do that, if that makes sense. So I kind of look at it as an investment in time. My time of programming these little shortcuts saves me the time and the mental overhead while I'm actually being creative and working on projects. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just downloaded Metagrid. It's $30, but it's totally worth it. I can tell already. They've got native Keyboard Maestro integration. We talk often on the show about the Stream Deck, which is a little device you can plug in and press buttons on.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, but yeah. So I have two Stream Decks. I have one of the original 12-button or 15-button ones, right? Yeah. On my right-hand side, right above my trackball. And then on my left side, I've got one of the Stream Deck Pros, the big guys, the X's or whatever they call them, right? And so, so that's another huge part of my workflow, the Stream Decks. I'm a huge fan of those guys too.
So you're using both Metagrid and Stream Deck to do different types of work?
Yep. I've got two Stream Decks. One is set up really more specialized for Sibelius. So entering in dynamics and articulations, things like that. And then the other one is set up to, I have one set of samples. My brass library is different than all my other libraries. So I have the smaller Stream Deck is then to switch between the articulations specifically for that one brass library.
Yeah, because even though we've moved forward a lot in years, I'm working with some of this music software, not nearly as much as you, obviously. I still get the impression a lot of it is very menu driven, and there's a lot of digging going on. So getting it into these control surfaces probably saves you a lot of time.
Massive amount of time, and it's not just the time. It really is the mental overhead. I learned that kind of early on when I used to use. Do you remember Pi Engineering? And they had the X keys. Those. Yeah. They were like little button units, and so I used to have like 3 of those, and I just learned right off the bat that the more things that I don't have to try to think what's that shortcut again, where I just have to see a button and push it, it saves so much creative mental overhead, and so I was a pretty serious adapter, fairly early on, once I realized how much it would speed up my workflow. And it's all about speed, frankly, what I do. It's, time is money, deadlines are brutal. And so anything you can do to speed up that process and put your energy into writing music instead of trying to remember the technology, to me, that's golden and really worth it.
Yeah, and what is like on one of these? I know they vary, but how many different instruments are in one of these scores on average? Like for Frozen, how many instruments were you managing?
I'll work backwards. In the recording session, we had an orchestra of 95 for the Frozen. So we had 95 musicians in the studio. But then what my job is, or part of my job, is to mock up with all of my samples before we get to the recording studio. And so what that allows is the directors and producers to hear what they're going to hear essentially with the real musicians,
Yeah.
I do the legwork before, I show them what they're going to hear before they get there, because it's a lot more expensive. If they don't like anything, it's easier for me just to change it before we get to the studio than it is to have 95 musicians sitting around while I'm scrambling
Rewriting.
trying to change
Yeah.
things. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
so that's the whole point of all of my gear and everything, is to do these demos and mock-ups as demonstrations, to allow the filmmakers to hear and give them a heads up before it gets really expensive to change things. And that's, I've always looked at it that way too. That I've looked at it as the sample technology is not to replace musicians; it's a tool to help the process along. But I still use the live musicians always, and there just isn't anything like. Still, as great as the samples are, there's still nothing like real people. The breath and the life that real folks bring to a recording.
Yeah. Well, Metagrid is now installed on my iMac. On my iPad Pro. I cannot wait till after the show to set it up, because this looks like this is going to be great for me. But
Awesome.
I want to talk about that process next.
This episode of Mac Power Users is brought to you by Matthias, the Macintosh keyboard experts. When you need a new keyboard for your Mac, Matthias has you covered with beautiful options you won't find anywhere else. They've been around since 1989, it's almost as long as me, and specialize in keyboards designed to work correctly for a Mac. That means they'll work just like an Apple keyboard does, no drivers to install, no software to worry about. Their chief designer, Edgar Matthias, said that over the years, they've purposely chosen to focus on making products that Apple doesn't offer, so us Mac users have more choices. They offer backlit wireless keyboards beautifully designed to look great with your Mac. Their programmable Ergo Pro is an ergonomic mechanical keyboard with amazing comfort and a spacious gel palm support. Their top seller right now is the wired aluminum keyboard, which is a truly worthy successor to the original Apple wired aluminum keyboard that was discontinued back in 2017. One thing that's really cool, all their wired keyboards have built-in hubs, as proper Mac keyboards should, so you don't have to run your mouse back around to your display. You just plug it right into the keyboard. It's fantastic. Their function keys work just like they do on an Apple keyboard. You'll have no loss of functionality, and there's nothing new to learn. Everything just works correctly out of the box. A good keyboard makes your work better. I've checked out several of their models over the years, and they really are as good as they say. So head on over to matthias.ca/MPU for a 10% discount. That's MATIAS.ca/MPU for a 10% discount. Go there now, check them out, and get yourself a great keyboard. I really do recommend it. Our thanks to Matthias for their support of the show and Relay FM.
So, David, I understand. I mean, your job is to get to that point, actually, to get to the point where you're in the studio with the 95 musicians and maybe even a little bit of work beyond that. But I don't really have a good understanding of it, kind of soup to nuts. And I thought it would be fun to talk through from the moment you get to the job to the moment you finish the job, and how the Apple technology helps and where it fits in the process. So let's just start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
How does this begin?
Cool. Well, the first thing is getting the job. That's always the old saw, isn't it? The hard part is getting the job. And I'm so fortunate at this point that I've been around. I'm old enough that I've been around long enough that people come to me, and I haven't had to worry for a long time about trying to get work. But when you do get the call, then and it kind of, the process varies depending on who I'm working with. My roles aren't always the same, but I'll kind of sort of generalize, when I'm kind of an arranger and orchestrator of either the songs or the score. And so the first thing that happens is you go into a meeting with the director and producer and the composer, if I'm not the composer, and you just watch down the film and talk about where the music's supposed to go or where it would be good to have music and what kind of music, stylistically would work there. And so you kind of talk through the concept of the flow of the music for the film. And that's called a spotting session. And that's really the first time that you really have a chance to really get a feel for what the director is looking for and stylistically and all that. And then after that, you pretty much go off and you work for maybe a couple weeks and you start writing themes or you start, the first phases of the mock-up process. And then you'll have a meeting with the director again in after those couple of weeks and you play back the 5 minutes of music you might have done in that period. And then they have a chance to listen to it and give their comments and you develop your dialogue together and your collaborative process at that point. And then that kind of just goes on for a while. You go back then and you start writing some more music and you make the changes that they ask for and you keep having these meetings and playback sessions and eventually you get to the point of where all the music is signed off. And at that point, then I flip over to orchestration mode.
All right. Let me interrupt there then. Let me just interrupt there. So let's go back and talk about this initial kind of music creation phase. All right. Mm-hmm. So when you go back to your studio, you're looking at your Macs and your keyboards and your iPads and all these things. I mean, what are the apps you use and how do you start doing this? I would assume you kind of start with like motifs or small melodies, but that obviously grows and I don't understand how that happens.
Yeah. So the first thing I do, and I think a lot of folks do it, is I'll just start, and I'm a horrible keyboard player, by the way. I'm like, for the longest time, I was the world's worst piano player, and eventually I graduated up to like the second worst in the world. So I'm really a horrible piano player, but I have enough skills.
You're a bass player by trade. That was your start.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, but I have enough skill that I've developed over the year to know how to really get the music into the sequencer, into the computer. And what I always start out with is a piano part. That stage, I call it a guide piano. And other people call it other things, I'm sure. But that's where you're watching picture. And so the picture is loaded up inside a Cubase in the sequencer. And so it's all synced. You can start anywhere in the sequence and it'll be synced up, And so then I'll just start playing around with ideas and tempos to picture, and then right,
when
I feel
like I'm there again. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm going to interrupt you a few times.
No, that's cool.
When you say picture, are you being like the fancy Hollywood guy, meaning the movie, or is it?
That's
pictures?
Correct. Yeah, sorry. Okay. No, it is. It's the movie. Yeah,
I've met Hollywood guys. I had clients that invest in movies and stuff, and they're always, whenever you meet the guy says, "Hey, you want to get in the picture business?" That's when I get nervous, But
yeah, rightly so, by the way. But no, it's the film, and usually at the point that you start working on the music, it's still a rough cut. It's not fully edited yet, so that's also part of the equation. You have to remember that there's going to be changes to the film and to the edit throughout the whole process that you're working on it. So
okay, so the picture or the movie file goes into the sequencing program, so it actually displays video as well as managing your music.
That's correct. It's
I didn't know that.
So it's yeah. So there's in Cubase, and all sequencers are kind of the same anymore. But Cubase, there's a video track, and so you just drop your QuickTime or whatever you're getting file into the program, and you can line it up, and there's time code. There's still a time SMPTE burn window on these, so you can, you just enter that time code into the start time on your sequencer, and that's how everybody stays synced up.
Now, if the film editor makes any edits, though, does that cause massive problems for you later, since you're basing everything on it?
That's correct. Massive problems. And that's when, but that's the part of the gig. So you just accept that. So then at that point, you just have to chase the edits. So they'll provide you hopefully with where they've, taken out 10 frames or whatever. And so then you have to either cut beats out of the sequence, or you have to change the tempo of the sequence to try to arrive at the same important hit points, the important moments that you're trying to catch musically, to the film. Or else if they've added, they hardly ever add. It's always kind of taken away. But if they add, then you have to add in X number of beats to to account for those that material. But and then
So,
you
so,
can
so in this first phase, just if I can
yeah,
summarize, you've
sure.
got the picture playing, and then you've got a piano track. You've kind of set the music as you want it to that, and that's what you're
hmm
working with the director on as you do this initial phase.
Actually, not quite. There's then after I've done my piano part to where I feel good about it, then I'll go through and mock it up with my orchestra samples or synthesizers or whatever I want to use, and then that's what I would play for the director.
And is that the full 95 piece orchestra, or is that something smaller?
That's my synthesized and sample mock-up of what will be the 95 musicians.
Okay,
And
all right.
that's all done with my computers then before any live people have come on board.
Okay,
Of
so
course.
you're sort of making the blueprints in your studio, putting all the pieces together, and once
Yeah,
that's cohesive and everyone gives you the thumbs up, that's when it moves to real life.
exactly. That's exactly right.
It's fascinating to me. No matter what you're making, whether it's movies or books or whatever, the whole idea is to make all the big moves, the navigational big decisions with the least amount of resources. Because
hmm
if if you start putting the meat on the bones and then you want to change something, it costs so much more money. But it's interesting
hmm
to me. Everybody we talk to, whether they're scientists or musicians, they all do it the same way at that
Wow.
level.
Fascinating. I actually hadn't thought about that, but I'm well, you guys have seen it, and I'm sure that's true. And and just sort of going back in time a little bit, that's I think one of the huge changes in life that computers have had on at least the art world. Is that 50 years ago you couldn't do this. The first time the director would hear the music would be in the studio with the 95 musicians. And if they didn't like the themes or whatever, you had a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And so the computers then have really one of the huge benefits, I believe, has been it does allow to do this. The beginning phases in a way that makes everybody happier with and more comfortable, I suppose, moving forward.
Yeah, I remember when I was in high school, I did a little bit of studio work as a saxophonist, and my
Uh-huh.
very first studio gig, I walked in, somebody handed me the music, and it was literally on my music stand, and then they said, "Okay, here we go. This room costs $3,000 every half hour. If you screw up, you will never be asked back." And then they pressed there wasn't even a rehearsal. They pressed the red button, and I
Right.
started playing. I mean, I'm like, man, you think legal law is stressful? Jeez, crazy.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's still the way it is for the musicians. As an aside, that the orchestra players, the musicians, when they show up, they're sight reading. They haven't seen any of the music before they get to the studio. So I'm in complete awe of all of the musicians that I work with and that play my music because they are so good. They just sit there and they play it. And I write some really hard stuff, and but it's that whole thing of they have the skill set that is tremendous.
Yeah. All right. So I interrupted you earlier. But you're working through this preliminary stage with, kind of getting the right feel for the director. Hopefully there's not a lot of edits. But then you said, then you moved to orchestration and I cut you off. So let's talk about that
Oh
next.
yeah, no worries. Yeah. So at that point, once everything's signed off and everybody's good to move forward to actually then spending the money to go into the studio, then I transfer my work that I've done in Cubase, which is the sequencing program. So Cubase is great for coming up with creative ideas on the fly and being able to manipulate them and stuff, but it's not real good at printing up scores and parts for the musicians to play. So then the next phase for me is then taking my Cubase file and converting it to notation in Sibelius, which is the notation program I use now, and that involves I kind of do a cleanup pass in Cubase to get there's things over the decades that I've learned that are easier to clean up in Cubase, like note endings, how long a note is held for, accidentals. It's easier to change the sharps and flats in Cubase for some reason than it is when you send it to the notation program. But it just is. So there's about 20 things like that. So I'll clean it up in Cubase. I create an XML file, which is then a visual of the rudimentary notation output that Cubase will do. But so I send it from Cubase and open that up in Sibelius. And so what that does is it's all of the information is still manipulatable in Sibelius. So then I can still assign, I can copy and paste, the material into. So like if I wanted to copy, have a flute double what the violins are doing, I would do that in Sibelius. So I can, still move all the material around. And in Sibelius is where then I'll do things like I'll enter the dynamics, like the mezzo forte or the forte or the piano indications, and the articulations like the staccatos and things like that, and the phrase markings, slurs, things like that. I do all that in Sibelius, and so that's where I really create the score. But I have the advantage. A lot of times, there'll be a separate person doing that, either composing or arranging stage in the sequencer, and then a separate person will do the notation work. But one of the things I'm very fortunate to be able to do is I do both sides of it. So
Yeah.
when I'm writing in Cubase, I kind of know what I need to do to make it easier in Sibelius. So I kind of have, again, streamlined the whole process as much as I can. And again, in Sibelius, I know what I know already. When I get to Sibelius, I know what I did in Cubase. So I know, I was writing with a certain purpose in Cubase that then I know what I need to do in Sibelius, if that all makes sense. But
Yeah.
it's just, I'm very fortunate and happy that I can kind of do both sides of that equation. Because it kind of has more creative purpose, I think, that way too. Instead of trying to second guess, I know specifically what was going on. So,
Well, I totally get it. I mean, as a lawyer,
Yeah.
I'm the same way. I always
Yeah.
kind of manage the whole widget, and as a result, the final product is just, in my opinion, better.
Yeah.
How do you keep
Yep.
track though? Like if you're working in, like, there's something you want to do in Sibelius later, how do you make sure you remember to do it? Because in your case, you're going to have foul notes or all sorts of problems if you don't get that fixed when you move it over.
That's right. And I just always, in Sibelius, one of the beautiful things of using a notation program is you have playback. So even though it's not very good quality, you can actually listen to the notation file that you've done. And so if you have any really bad clunkers, you're going to hear them, and that's one advantage, again, of using a computer as opposed to doing everything by hand, like I did for so long when I was younger. Because, when you're looking at a hand score, you just have to be able with your eyes to really see where the mistakes might be or where you made a clam. But when you can play back in the notation file with audio feedback, you can hear those problems. And so that's one of the things.
Now, let me interrupt you one more time. So you said the audio is not as good. So does that mean Sibelius doesn't take advantage of all your hardware? So you don't get the really great playback
Correct.
from Sibelius. All right. So your fans are quieter then, but it doesn't sound as good.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of that's funny. That's one of the really dilemmas, though, frankly, about this field of work, is that there are programs like Cubase sequencers that do an amazing job of doing demonstrations, of what live musicians will do, but they don't notate very well. Right? The notation they're not designed to make the printed music look very good. And then you get the notation programs like Finale and Sibelius that look great, but they don't have all the playback capabilities to make it sound good. So there's been my whole life, there's been this search for the holy grail program that will do both. And I'm not the only person. If somebody could come up with a program that is a great sequencer, but also has great notation, I would be in heaven. I could die and be a happy man, at that point. And there, in fact, is a program that's on, I think, the path towards that. And it's called Dorico. And it's a Steinberg software that is, and Steinberg is the company that makes Cubase. So Dorico, they're trying to really build it to where it will do both of those worlds. And it's still a fairly young program, and it's getting better and better every revision, as you would expect. I still don't feel quite comfortable enough to just switch over to using it, but I really am hopeful within I don't know how many years, but within my lifetime, they'll crack the nut. And because that honestly is the hardest part of my job. It's the going back and forth between Cubase to Sibelius. And it just, if you could do everything in one under one hood, it would be a lot easier.
Now, if you make a change in Sibelius, do you have to like round trip it back to Cubase, or is your Cubase file then become kind of like the moment in time that you exported it, but then it kind of loses relevance at that point?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep. Once I move to Sibelius, I never go back to Finale. Golly, I keep saying Finale. I never go back to Cubase with very, very few rare exceptions.
Which is a shame, because then you don't get to actually hear the Finale version with all your fancy computers and sounds.
Well, they exist, and I print obviously an audio file of my mock-ups that I have to play for the director, and so those files still do exist. And I think I can't remember Frozen or Frozen 2 on the CD soundtracks might have some of my demos. I can't remember if they have some of my synth demos that are there that people can hear. And I might be wrong. I can't remember, if they do or not. But it is sort of true. You put a ton of work. My wife gives me a hard time all the time too. You work so hard on these demos, and then they never get heard. And she's kind of right, but it's just part of the job. That's the way in 2020. That's how you have to do things. It's nobody really can go back and just do it the old-fashioned, old school way, which I still love, by the way. Writing by hand, I love the concept, but because it feels really organic, but it just is not a viable way in the commercial film world now to really work. So you accept that, and that's how that's what you do. But the one thing I'll say too, that what Cubase does is it spits out the way that it does live for the recording session is they take the tempo map from my Cubase file, and that becomes the click track that the musicians record to. So essentially the metronome that the musicians record to. And the reason for that is then that stays in sync. Since I wrote it in sync to the picture, it stays in sync for the recording session. So that part of Cubase does live on, at least till the recording session.
And I would argue that it's these demos that you make is the reason that the recording sessions come out so amazing. I mean, it's part of the process to get you there.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, David. I think that that's true. That and one thing is I'm really passionate. I mean, so many people are, but I really am passionate about trying to make things as really great as they can be. And I don't ever take shortcuts. I don't settle. I really believe that the music deserves the attention, the most attention that you can give it to make it sound as great as possible. And I put that attention to detail in my demos. At some point I should send you something or whatever, and you can kind of hear some, what I do on some of these things, because they do sound pretty darn realistic, and I try to send the heart, put the emotion, the heart into my demos that I do believe translates over when we get to the real musicians who only make it way better. They just take it a whole nother step higher.
Well, I was going to ask you if you could send us some pictures of your setup, with all the iPads and keyboards. So we'll put in the show notes. We also have a newsletter that goes out. I don't know if you have a small bit of music you can use without getting in trouble with anybody, that you could share. I think we probably have the ability to share images. I think music files, they can only get so big. Stephen, what can we do in terms of show notes in terms of giving a link to a music file?
Yeah, we can upload something somewhere and link to it.
Yeah, so if you can give us just a small sample of something, we'll put that in the show notes too, so folks can check that out.
Yeah, okay, cool.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by Eero. Go to Eero.com/MPU and get your Eero delivered with free next day shipping and get the Wi-Fi every home deserves. These days, your house isn't just your home. It's an office. It's a school. It's a movie theater. It's a restaurant. All of these activities and more put a strain on your Wi-Fi. It's not good enough to only have Wi-Fi working in a room or two. You need solid Wi-Fi in your whole house so everyone isn't working on top of each other. In other words, you need Eero. Eero is an Amazon company that covers your whole home with fast, reliable Wi-Fi inside and out. Rooms with bad to no Wi-Fi, dropouts on your patio, you know the problems. We all have them. But Eero solves them. Eero makes every square foot of your house usable by eliminating poor coverage and dead spots. You'll have a consistently strong signal wherever you need it. You can be on a work call, the kids can be on remote learning, and someone can be streaming videos, and Eero can handle it. Eero is fast and easy to set up. You just plug it into your modem and you're good to go. You manage Eero from a super simple app. You can pause for dinner and get alerts if any device attempts to join your network. We're asking a lot of our Wi-Fi. Eero can help yours do more. Go to eero.com/MPU and enter code MPU at checkout to get free next day shipping with your order. That's Eero, EERO.com/MPU and code MPU at checkout to get your Eero delivered with free next day shipping. Our thanks to Eero for their support of the Mac Power users and all of Relay FM. All right, so you mentioned earlier that, after you do all this work, you print the music out, you go in a big room full of musicians that get the red light pointed at them, and then they have to record it. How does that feel?
Well, I'll tell you, that is my favorite part of the entire process, because all of my work up to that point, almost all of it, has just been by myself in my little studio room, my personal studio. And so I'm working really on my own. And then to get to the studio and actually see some other people is always kind of nice. But mainly it's to hear again what these amazing musicians bring to the notes on the page. They're really this abstract kind of thing, but they bring it to life. And it's just the absolute best part of the whole process. And
I have to admit, it was that watching that series. I mean, I figured out you were a Mac guy, but then they had a scene in the studio and they had the movie playing in the background. All these musicians just killing this score. And there's a shot of you there, and there's just so much delight on your face. I'm like, I want to talk to this person and hear his story. I mean, I can tell that is a big deal. And you're right, it is a very solitary thing that you do up until that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd also like to interject. There's one more step before we get to the studio. So once I've written my full score in Sibelius, I then send those files to a music copyist, and so they take my file where I'm only worrying about the full score that the conductor would see, and then that anybody who wants to see what the whole big picture is doing. But then what the music copyists do is they prepare all the individual parts. So they'll extract the flute part only off of my score and make a part just for the flute player. And likewise with the violins or the trumpets. So there's and then they print all of the music up, the actual physical sheet music they print up, and then they put it out on the stands for the musicians. So that's actually to me a very important part of the whole step that the music prep people are. I'm huge fans of those folks as well too, because they take care of all those kind of the smaller details that are extremely important to actually get us on the stage and get the red light on.
I just assumed that Sibelius would have done that as well. I'm surprised that it has to go through another process.
They do it Sibelius does it. It's just that it's another step to get like page turns. Like if you have like a 200 bar cue, that there's going to be a couple of page turns in there. And for musicians, as to make a page turn, if it's not laid out right, you got to stop playing to be able to make the page turn if there aren't rests at the end of that page, to allow you time to make the turn. So that's where it takes Sibelius and Dorco and Finale will all do that automatically to some extent, but you still need real people that will go through and look at it and make sure that it makes sense for the musicians when they actually get there.
Not screwing over the trumpet player.
That's right. Yeah. And believe me, the trumpet players are really important,
Yeah.
No, they're all important.
Like the trumpets in B flat where you're writing everything in concert C, does Sibelius also do all the transposition for you?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, some people will still write in a transpose score is what it's called, where all of those transpositions for the French horns and the trumpets and clarinets and all that are already taken into account. But the way that the Hollywood film music world has worked for as long as I've been around, which is at least 30 something years, 40 years, everything is written in a concert score. So it's written at concert pitch, and then the music prep people then prepare the parts that are transposed.
Yeah. So you're not going to make the trumpet player transpose and sight read, right? You're going to give it to him in B flat.
And you're right. And that's exactly what one would think, right? But the fact is, and this blows my mind and I don't understand why we still do it this way, but so often the trumpet players will play C trumpets instead of B flat trumpets.
Okay.
So the music prep people prepare the parts in B flat. So the trumpet players actually are transposing on the stand while they're sight reading. And I never quite understood that. And I need to find out more of why don't we just print C trumpet parts, Yeah. But anyway, I digress.
And for listeners who are not musicians, that's like mental jujitsu it's like
right.
It's like to read a book out loud and translate it into French at the same time. I don't know what the analogy is, but it's hard.
It's really hard. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So is that the end for you in the studio once they do the recording, or are there any more involvement?
Nope. Then there is more involvement. So we get through the recording sessions, and then you get to the stage that's called mixing. And what that is it's taking all of the recordings that you've done, and so they're really raw recordings. So if you just played back without any adjustments, the violins might be too soft or the percussion might be too loud. So then you go through the step called mixing, where it used to be you would sit in a studio altogether, a different studio, and the engineer would kind of get the balances right. And then I would, and the composers or whoever else is involved would give notes to the mixer, the engineer, and then they would make adjustments until you finally arrive at what you feel is the perfect mix. And that used to be done always, like I was saying, in person. But though anymore, it's becoming more and more in this world where audio files just get sent back around, and you just listen in your own space and make notes that go back to the engineer, and then they make notes. So when you and then at the point that you have the final music mix, then there's one more stage of involvement, and that's called the dub, which is the final dub is where the sound effects are mixed in. There's a whole nother engineer that does the mixing of the sound effects and the dialogue and the music. And it's not uncommon for the composer or arranger to be involved in those sessions as well, where you'll go in and you'll just listen to the final dub and again, give usually a minimal number of notes. And so that then becomes the final step that I am typically involved in.
So in this process, have you ever had like one passage of music that you just love the way it came out, and then you get to the end and the sound effects and the voice have lowered the volume so much that you can't hear, or even worse, they've just cut the scene? Have you ever had your heart broken?
I try not to be that precious about anything, because I figure I'm kind of in a way in a service industry. I'm there to serve the film. I'm there to serve the vision of the director. So I try not to get to the point of where I'm so depressed and heartbroken. But it happens very frequently. I remember one film I worked on where all the music that was written for specific scenes ended up getting moved around to be on scenes that wasn't even written for. So none of the music actually lived for the scenes that it was written for. They just decided to move it all over the film. And so I remember seeing it and I was going, this makes no sense,
Yeah,
and being kind of bummed about
Yeah.
that. Yeah. And as far as the sound effects things, yeah, especially like action films, you always, you spend, weeks sometimes working on these like 8-minute chase scenes or whatever, or car chases or gun battles or whatever it's going to be, and you work and you work and you work and you go back and forth and make it the changes and everything. and you record it, and then you get to you watch the picture, and it's all gunshots or car screeches, and so the music you can't even hear, and all that time, and effort that you put into it, it's not wasted, of course, but you kind of you sometimes can have that disappointment, but again, it's a team effort. We're all there working together to try to make the film the best as it possibly can be, and everybody's vision's not always going to be the same, and that's just part of the gig.
Yeah. Now, Stephen, what you said you saw Frozen 700 times?
Yeah,
Was that your number?
Many times.
Okay. Now, David, in the process of doing this whole process for Frozen, how many times do you think you saw it?
Oh gosh. So now Frozen's a little different for me because I don't tend to see the whole film in a run through, straight run through. I'll be at the screenings and stuff, but I'm focusing more on just the songs,
Yeah.
So I see those songs like thousands of times, I guess you could almost probably figure.
I'm sure. Do you still enjoy them after they come out? I mean, do you watch the movies and enjoy them after having worked on them for so long?
Well, I'll have to say there are some films that, I do. I don't ever get tired of some of the ones that I've worked on, and Frozen and Frozen 2 too were films like that where I don't know, I just felt so I thought that they turned out pretty well, and I suppose there's it's not a good thing, but I suppose there's a level of pride there, that you feel like you did a decent job, and so I some films like that I really don't get tired of, and in fact, and Frozen for me has been kind of almost a side cottage industry in a way too, because I've worked on theme park versions of those songs. I did the Broadway version of Frozen, so I lived with those songs all again in a whole different instrumentation and world, and so Frozen has really been kind of a pretty big part of my life for the last, 8 years or 9 years now that I've been started working on the first one, I guess, and so so some projects I just feel, and a lot of it sounds corny or something, but I really look at my work, I really try to make the world a better place. I don't know if I know it sounds...
There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
But I think I try to look at it as trying to bring some beauty to the world and some happiness. And I feel that Frozen and especially Disney projects in general, all around, that I've worked on, I feel that that's a big part of what I enjoy most of having the opportunity to work on them.
I never forget. I was sitting in, because I'm an older guy. I'm not big into Frozen, but I was at Disneyland once, and a bunch of kids just started spontaneously singing a Frozen song, and they were having so much fun. And I'm like, you are making the world a better place. I mean, people are bringing joy. Now I want to get back a little bit nerdy here. Earlier you mentioned Keyboard Maestro, and I let that slide by, but I did not forget it. So what are you doing with Keyboard Maestro in this whole process?
Tons and tons and tons of things. And so I don't even know how many macros I've got with Keyboard Maestro at this point, but it's probably 1,000, I'd guess, and they trigger, for the most part, they're one-offs, that they might be a Stream Deck button, will trigger one of the macros, but again, I'm always looking to streamline as much as I can, and Keyboard Maestro really does a great job of that.
Okay, give me an example. Like, what's the most recent one you made? What problem did it solve?
Okay, I know one thing is that I was working on. It was a film. Yeah, it was a film. I can't probably say what it was it hasn't come out yet, but I was working on it like about a month ago, and I had to go back and forth between looking at a PDF of the piano vocal, like the sketch part of the song, and and my Sibelius file, and I was still working in Cubase at that point too on the piece. So I had to look at these three things. But I didn't want to just do the command tilde, flipping, or command tab going through apps, the different programs. And so I wrote a Keyboard Maestro to where I could just do a shortcut directly to preview, and then back to, back to Cubase, or back to, so it just enabled me to really control my workflow without having to think about it, without
Yeah.
having to, because I don't know about you, but when I would do the command tab thing, I overshoot, and so then I have to figure out like what, where do I really want to end up? And so that was that actually was the exact last one I wrote, but it's those sort of things that are just so helpful. And again, I always am looking to combine as many things as I can. In Sibelius, to enter dynamics, you select the note and then you do Command E, and then you hold down Command while you're typing the dynamic, like mezzo forte, MF, and then you have to hit Escape twice to get back out to to be able to work on stuff. So that's a lot of key presses, right?
Yeah.
But so then I programmed those in Keyboard Maestro to do the whole macro, and then I trigger that all with Stream Deck, with one button there, and it's stuff like that saves days and days, when over a year,
Yeah.
and so yeah, it's a lot of those kind of things.
Do you find yourself using pauses a lot with those triggers with the multiple keystrokes?
I always try to do it without, I always think, I bet you this is going to work without the pause, and sometimes that happens, but it seems like inevitably, I don't know, maybe half of my macros I have to insert a pause and the other half can go through.
It's a great tool when you're building something. It's like, oh, it's just falling apart. The pause will often save you.
Yep, exactly right.
Pause will set you free. I just wrote one yesterday for drafts, and it was the same thing. I'm like, why is this not working? I'm like, oh yeah, 0.1 second pause. In fact, now that I mention it, I just need to make a Keyboard Maestro script to insert a 0.1 second pause in Keyboard Maestro.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Because I think I use that more times than Stevens watched Frozen.
Ooh. Oh man.
So you've got, I really like the way you've handled that problem, because you're right. So much of working on computers gets in the way of creativity. And honestly, that is to me the value argument for the Mac. I mean, I've worked on PCs and it always felt like working on PCs meant that you had to be able to interrupt your creative thought to do like defrag a drive or something stupid. And whereas on the Mac, not only is the hardware reliable, a lot of the tools on the Mac are built around the creative process. So you can just be thinking about writing or creating music or doing whatever it is that you create, your form of art. And
completely agree.
Yeah. And I just like the way you've also like gone that extra level of saying, I want to create art. So when the music software makes me, press 5 keystrokes and then escape twice, I'm going to take that out of the process too.
Yep. And that's it. It's all about, again, for me, it's the mental overhead. If I can put that towards the creative side, that's where computers really benefit, is that you can really focus. And you're so right about Apple and Mac products, is that I buy a piece, like I bought a Surface, I don't know, like 3 years ago or something, because there was one program that again was only PC at that point, and I wanted to really just check it out, and so you had to buy it. But then I get there and I'm just like, this, it's just not natural, and you can't find anything, and the Mac process is so streamlined to the way that I think and the way that I work. It's gold, they're golden machines.
Now, I'm going to create a hypothetical Mac for you. All right. And this doesn't exist, but let's say that a few years in the future, once Apple makes this transition to Apple Silicon, they make an iMac, a 27 or a 30-inch iMac that can tilt down like a drafting table, and you can write your music with an Apple Pencil on the screen. Would that be useful to you?
And that's been another one of my holy grails forever. I actually went through the process at one point of getting a touchscreen, and there was some company, and I can't remember now what the company is because it's been a number of years, but they built a driver for Macs for this Dell touchscreen, and I then went in and I tried to, in Sibelius, tried to do the notation using the pencil in. And because I always thought, man, if I could go back to writing by hand, it always felt so natural to me and so organic, but then have the benefit of the computer. But then when I got there and I did it, I realized, but I missed so many other things that, shortcuts and things that the actual working in it as a computer instead of a hand a pencil thing was better. So I actually kind of got off that jag for a while, But if if anybody could do it, it would be you, David, who could figure out the way to make it like perfect for me. That would be great. I would love that.
I almost think it probably wouldn't work for you because of you're such a geek and you figured out a way to automate so much stuff. I'm not sure it would work. But the one thing that stands out for me, and I forget the name of the manufacturer, what's the name of the company that makes the tablets you write on, you can connect to your Mac?
Wacom?
Wacom. They make one that has a screen in it where you could actually put Sibelius on that screen and write on it. But I suspect it was probably just getting away for you. Terms of speed.
Yeah. It's hard to know because I don't know how much of it is that I need to adjust my mindset, to going back to working that way. But I bet there would be some kind of perfect hybrid world that would take advantage of both processes. But that also takes a lot of trial and error too, and to figure that kind of stuff out. And but there are apps that are handwriting apps. Music
like iPad
handwriting apps, on the iPad, and every year, about once a year, I'll go back through and I'll give them another shot. But they still, again, they're stunning works of software coding, I think, but they're still not faster, And to me, if it's not faster and kind of more in my approach, user friendly, why do it yet,
Yeah, and I can't imagine there being any faster way to put music into a computer than use a keyboard. And I mean like a musical keyboard, not a
yes. Yeah. As an aside, though, it's fantastic. It's fascinating to me because actually Sibelius and Finale have computer keyboard entry systems. So without using a music keyboard, you just type in like, A is the note A, and I look at some people that's how they always enter everything. And it's like, I'm blown away at how fast they could do it. Cause it's actually pretty quick if you have studied that and practiced it. So, but I don't think that way. My mind still thinks on a MIDI keyboard.
This episode of Mac Power Users is brought to you by Hover, one of Relay FM's longest running sponsors. When you have a big idea, where do you go? Whether it's a project, a business, whatever it may be, Hover is your first big leap because your business or project starts with a domain name. Hover has over 300 domain name extensions to choose from, so no matter what you want to build, there's a domain name there waiting for you. They have excellent technical support to answer any questions you may have, and they're dedicated to getting you online, not upselling you. I love if I'm helping somebody out with a website or a domain, getting their stuff into Hover, and they're shocked at how clean and easy it is to use. You don't feel like you're getting tricked while you're just dealing with regular domain stuff. Buy your domain and start using it today. Go to hover.com/MPU and get a 10% discount on all new purchases. That URL one more time, hover.com/MPU. Make a name for yourself with Hover. Our thanks to Hover for their support of the show. So we've spent a lot of time talking about your setup, and it is incredibly impressive, but oftentimes there's apps and services that are kind of the glue between things. What are some of those favorite smaller tools that you're using that maybe we haven't gotten to yet?
Stephen, there's a couple that we haven't talked about that I know I have used, and they tend to be more specific situations that I've used them and found them helpful. One I can think of is, I'm pretty sure it's PDF Reader. Is that it? Golly, this is horrible. I should have known the name. But what it allows you to do on the iPad is to use the Apple Pencil and annotate onto PDFs.
Yeah, there's several of those.
It's Goodreader. I think it's Goodreader.
Oh,
right?
Goodreader. That's a classic. Yes.
Yep. Sorry, I botched the name, but it's Goodreader. And I was first introduced to that when I was in in rehearsals in for one of the Broadway shows for Frozen. Actually, it was one of the companies in Frozen, and always in my life I've had these giant printed out scores. That they're 11 by 17-inch pages paper that you flip through. So the whole score is there in paper form. But then I had this guy who said, well, you should just put all your scores as a PDF on an iPad, and it's so much easier. And I was thinking, no, it won't be. But then I finally tried it, and it was like, holy cow, what have I been missing all this time? And so it's so cool because in a rehearsal then, and especially when it's dark in a theater, it's hard to like see the score. So, but on an iPad, of course, you can adjust the light however you want it to be. And so then you can make your notes, and then it's easy to find them later, and you can erase them and then make the next set of notes. And so, especially in theater music, I think that that Goodreader was like just a big shining beacon there that was so many people had discovered that it took me a while to get on board with.
I want to blow your mind, David. There's another app called Fourscore. Forscore.
Yeah,
it's made for musicians. It does the same thing, but like you can, it's made to display music, and you can even attach a Bluetooth pedal to it so it can turn pages for you.
Right, turn pages. Right, I've heard of it, and I've actually never done it. So that's on my list now to check out Fourscore. Cool.
Yeah, Goodreader is still there. I mean, that app was like the initial one that everybody used, and they did a great job of making it like opens anything. I don't know that there's any type of file you can put on an iPad that Goodreader can't seem to open, and I'm glad it continues to get developed.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Yeah, and I can think of another app that I use. It's a little lower on my rotation now, but for about 5 years, it was huge. And it's an app called Touch OSC. And so what it was it was kind of like Metagrid before Metagrid, but it deals with OSC messages, which I'm not quite geeky enough to really fully understand how those work, but you have a receiver on the Mac. And then so it sends out these OSC messages that essentially then can trigger Keyboard Maestro, or it also will send in MIDI information. So you can and so you could build your own interface on the iPad so you could have faders that would send MIDI information, or you could make little buttons that would then send out triggers to do anything, or it would send MIDI notes. So sometimes for key switching between articulations, like we were talking about earlier, before I really kind of spent the time to totally dial it in, I would send MIDI notes to change articulations. And so Touch OSC has been a huge favorite of mine for a long time, and it's kind of been supplanted by Metagrid and the Stream Decks. And actually, I don't remember if I brought it. I have a Loop Deck CT, one of those controllers too, that I'm using now.
What is that?
It's I should send you a link. It's awesome, actually, is what it is. It's a little piece of awesome. And so it has a series of buttons that are hardware buttons. It has, let's see, a grid of, 12 software buttons that you can program, that have the little, what are they, OLED screens, that have the, tell you what it is or whatever. There are 6 knobs that you can turn. So like I'm using those to adjust velocity or mod wheel information in my sequencing steps. And then there's a big giant jog shuttle wheel right in the middle. And I've had it for maybe 2 months now. And it's, I think, pretty darn incredible. It's kind of like a combination of the best of things I've always wanted to have in one little itty bitty unit. So anyway, so all of these things have combined to minimize my TouchOSC usage. But I still will pull out sometimes if I have specific things I need to do that TouchOSC comes in good use for. It connects to a program on the Mac called Osculator, OSCulator. And at least, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. That's how I pronounce it.
Sure.
And so those two work together. Then the Osculator is the interpreter of the messages from TouchOSC. But those are those are ones that I really use a lot. I was going to say too, I'm just looking at my trackball now, just real quick. It's not an app, but it's sort of indispensable in the way I work. I've got one of the 4-button Kensington trackballs that are like, I think
Sure.
there's a Slim Blade, yeah, one of those guys. And I use the top 2 buttons as page forward and page back is my upper left and page forward is my upper right. And so like when I'm in Sibelius, it's just like, blah, 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 like you can just slam through pages really quickly with those top 2 buttons set like that. That's I just happened to see that. I was looking at my rig here.
Does Kensington still make that trackpad? At one point I'd heard they were going to stop making it, but I don't know if they ever did.
I had a previous incarnation of essentially the same thing I used for 5 or 6 years, and then it eventually broke down. And that's when I looked for another one of those and ended up with the Slim Blade. And I don't know if they're still made or not, but I know it seems like their driver support kind of comes and goes for Mac. I don't know. You guys know that probably way better than I do.
Yeah.
But that I tell you, that's been and I've owned, I don't know, I have a graveyard of trackballs and trackpads and mice, like I'm sure you guys do too. But pretty much any new-ish mouse, trackball, trackpad I will buy, and just see will it beat what I kind of currently have. And so far, this Kensington thing has been my go-to for 5-6 years, ever since it's been made, really.
Nice. Now, do you use a mouse as well, or just the trackball?
Just the trackball.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first started using a trackball like 20 years ago, I was going, man, this is like impossible, but once I got my thumb thing kind of going with it and the fingers, I don't know, a mouse to me just doesn't feel, it feels like you got to move things, and again, I sound so lazy by saying this, but I have my setup where I have my chair in front of all the stuff, and if I have to like lift my elbow off the chair, how lazy I am, to reach something that's not good, I like to have everything just like right to where it's right tight. And a trackball allows me to do that, whereas a mouse, I always felt like I had to move more and use more time and energy to kind of move it, which sounds really lazy.
It probably also helps you, though. I mean, I feel like for a guy like you, your ergonomics are so important. You have to be able to use your fingers to make your living, and you got to use the right tools, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm so glad you made time to come on the show, because I got so many questions answered today. Some of them about Maynard Ferguson and some of them about Max, but that's all good. Like I said, I just love to hear when people are making great stuff with their Macs, and that's what this show is all about.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate you thinking of inviting me in, and it's something I think is pretty obvious I take pretty seriously and have a real passion and love for, and I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to talk with you, both of you guys, and I'm hoping that somebody might take something away from this of interest.
We're going to put some pictures of David's, setup in the show notes, and then the newsletter. We'll also put some music in there if we're allowed to. We don't want to get you in trouble. And the we're going to put a link to your website. Is there anywhere else we should point you at? Are you a big Twitter guy or anything?
It sounds bad. I'm really not a social media guy at all. I always was afraid of getting, true fact, I was addicted to video games when I was like 18, 19 years old, the old arcade machines. And so I've always been afraid of anything after that. Once I kicked that habit, I kind of have stayed away. So social media, I'm not really big on, but probably my website is the, IMDb, maybe, if people are interested in that, would be the place to go.
I mean, maybe you're setting a good example for us, because you produce a lot of things and you don't do social media. So maybe there's something there.
I don't know.
All right. Thank you to our sponsors, Smile, Matthias, Eero, and Hover. Thanks again, David, for coming on the show. We're so pleased to have you. And we're the Mac Power users. You can find us over at relay.fm/MPU. Everybody head over, please, 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 to stjude.org/relay and make a contribution. Help them out. And we'll see you next week.